All right, welcome back for the second part of One Man's Faith today. We're looking at the spirit of faith walks by faith. And we were looking at James chapter 2, verse 21, or actually verse 20, that says, "But are you willing to recognize that faith without works is dead?" Now, there are two kinds of faith works, if I can say it that way. One type of faith work helps to bring the promise of God to pass. Okay? The other type of works almost seems to hinder the promise of God from coming to pass. And this is what James is talking about. This is the one that James is talking about here in this, when he says, "Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac, his son, on the altar?" Now, we got to understand what was going on here. God had spoken to Abraham. God had said, "Abraham, you're going to have a son. And through that son, look at the stars. If you can count them, that's how many descendants you're going to have." Remember, Abraham and Sarah were childless. She could not have children. Okay? But God said, through Sarah, you're going to have a son, and I'm going to bless the world through that son, and that who happened to be Isaac. Okay? So they have Isaac. God appears to Abraham and says, "Abraham, I want you to take your son, your only son, and I want you to go to where I tell you to, and I want you to sacrifice him." Now you see, that's against the promise. Okay? The promise was through that son, through Isaac, I'm going to bless you and bless the world, and you're going to have a multitude of descendants. And yet God is appearing to him and saying, "Hey, I want you to take Isaac and I want you to sacrifice him." Now, it wasn't just take him and kill him. It was a burnt offering. Okay? God's not into burnt offerings that way, not human burnt offerings. And yet, he told Abraham, and some of our Bibles say, and God tested Abraham by telling him. And so Abraham, without a word against it, without saying, "God, are you really, God, hey, this is the one I promised. How, you know what's going to happen here?" He didn't say no either. He didn't argue with God. He said, "Okay, where am I going?" And so he took Isaac, and it's very possible that Isaac was 30 years old when Abraham took him. Okay, Abraham's over 100. All right? And so Isaac went willingly with Abraham. Obviously, Isaac didn't fight Abraham when Abraham bound him and put him on the altar. Okay? And nothing was said when Abraham picked up the knife and was getting ready to cut his throat before he burned him, so that he wouldn't be alive, that his blood would drain out. But just as he was getting ready to do that, God stopped him. Okay? This is the work. This is the work. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac? You see, the faith that he had. Hebrews tells us that Abraham did that because Abraham knew that he had the promise through Isaac, and that God is faithful to his promises, and that he wouldn't allow him to kill Isaac unless he was going to raise him from the dead. Now, I believe God stopped him because the first one that's going to be raised from the dead is going to have to be, Jesus. How can he be the first fruits? But this is one of those that it's a work of faith that seems to hinder what God wants, or what God has promised, because God promised him that he would have many descendants through Isaac. And yet God is saying, I want you to sacrifice Isaac. And so Abraham was willing to do it because Abraham believed God. You see the faith that Abraham had, that the spirit of faith was all over Abraham. And Abraham says, okay, I'll do it because I know you've promised descendants through Isaac. So therefore, you're going to have to do a mightier work than just my believing in you. You're going to have to raise him from the dead. Now, Abraham never said that, but Abraham had to have known or had to have had that consciousness to see that if he slew the one through whom the promise was going to come, that God was going to have to do something to raise him from the dead. Because he said, well, God didn't say, and through one of your descendants, like, okay, I'll sacrifice this one and then we'll have another one. No. They were way too past that stage. Sarah probably would have killed Abraham, even if Abraham had come back and said that to her. Okay, hey, first son's gone, we got to have another one, so let's get to it. No, that was it. Isaac was it. And it was through him that they were going to see the promise. So Abraham is that type 2 work of faith, one that seems to hinder the promise from coming to pass. But by obeying what God said, God then changed the plan. There was a ram caught in a thicket, and Abraham offered the sacrifice using the ram. Now, that's type 2. Now, what about type 1? One that helps to bring about the promise. We can look at, one example is Moses and the children of Israel. The Amorites came against the children of Israel, and so they went out and did battle with the Amorites. Moses was sitting up on a hill watching, and every time Moses raised his hand, the children of Israel were winning. When his hands got tired and he put them down, the children of Israel were losing. God had promised that they would take the Amorites. And so Hur and Aaron held up Moses' hands, knowing that every time the hands were raised, they were winning. And so they held up his hands so that they took the battle. That's a work of faith that helps to bring about the promise, okay? The one that we just talked about with Abraham and Isaac is one that it seems to hinder the promise by following through with what God is asking. Let me give you another example of a type 2, one that seems to hinder. That is, you apply for a job. You get 3 possibilities back. Which one do you choose? Do you take the one that has the most money? If so, why? How do you know that that's the one God wants you to have? Did you ask him? See, these are questions we need to get into. These are things we need to understand, because the one with the highest amount of money could be one in which, if you accept it, within several months, that company goes bankrupt. Or it takes you away from your family and your church. While the other one that God wanted you to have, which paid less, maybe they were going to merge with a large company, let's say like Apple, and you'd get a promotion that way, making more money. Do you see? God says, yes, I'm going to prosper you. But just because you got 3 possibilities for a job and you pick the highest one because God's going to prosper you, doesn't necessarily mean. You see, that may seem to help towards the promise that God is going to prosper you, but if you haven't asked God, then you may be taking the wrong job. Oh, God wouldn't do that. Yeah, he would. Not that he's doing it. You didn't ask. You took the job you wanted. You're actually walking in unbelief when you do that. God had another job for you, a better job, really. It may have paid less, but it still would have brought prosperity to you. And within that other job, God had prosperity waiting for you. It seems like it would be a hindrance to take that job, and that it would hinder the prosperity that God had for you. But we don't know the outcome of that. God can see into the future and see that. We can't. So that's another example of a type 2, walking in faith in which it seems to hinder the promise of God from coming to pass. It just appears that because of our sight, we don't see out beyond that. A work of faith means that I don't trust myself and what I see or what I think, but I trust in what He says, what He tells me. That's walking in the spirit of faith. That's walking in faith. You cannot accomplish a divine mandate through the flesh, through deciding, all right, I can do this, or through saying, well, God gave me a brain for me to think and to figure this out on my own. No. God gave us a brain so that we would think through what God wants us to do and not question it, and do what He tells us to do. Do what He tells us to do. We need to learn. Listen, if God has said something to you, then walk it. Walk it. Many people get to a point of being disgruntled and feel useless because they have not followed through in faith with what God has asked them to do. God has called you to do something. You say, oh no, I don't want to do that. Kind of like Moses, but God, I just can't talk to people. But God said, no, I want you to lead the people of Israel. All right, break number 2 is now upon us, so let's go ahead and take that break. I'll be right back.